Okay, great. All right, well, good morning and welcome to another of our ACS podcasts. And this morning I'm joined by good friend and colleague and founding director of ACS, Richard Brown, who is principal at Toowoomba Christian College up in the beautiful Highlands area of Toowoomba. Richard, thank you for joining me this morning, and we're going to talk about something a little bit different this morning around training polite people, training our people to be polite. So why do we need polite people?
Well, I think when someone chooses a topic like polite people, people are going to tune out because they don't fully understand what's behind the word polite. I've done a bit of reading in various books from Lewis and from G.K. Chesterton, and they draw something to the attention of the reader. And what they do is they trace back to ancient Greek times the understanding of what it was to be polite. So it's not the modern concept. It's not trying to go back to an 18th century polite manners. It really is trying to understand what polite means. So the origin of polite comes from the Greek word polis. And if you think for a moment like metropolitan or politics or policy, you start to realise that, wait a minute, the root word for polite has many brothers and sisters, a lot of connection into bigger areas than just what I do nice to someone else. So politics and polite come from the root word polis. So if you look at a Greek dictionary, polis is just simply the word for a city-state. So those of us who've done a little bit of reading or remember our primary school days would remember that the Greeks, before they became a nation, were actually a whole group of city-states. So you had Sparta. Sparta would fight Athens. Athens would fight some other place like Corinth or whatever. And they were fighting each other, because that's most probably what you did in those days. To expand, you fought or you took over someone else's resources. But when you come to what Lewis and Chesterton saw, was that there was a lot more thinking from the Greek philosophers of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle that said, wait a minute, rather than destroying each other, rather than attacking each other, fighting and seeing who's got the better army, it's how should we live peacefully? How do we have a society that actually works in cohesion, in same desire? How do we train ourselves up so we're not just training warriors to defend, we're actually training our leaders of tomorrow who will preserve the very good things that we as a community want. So polite people, it's a long answer to your question, but it's got me going. Polite people were people who understood what it was to be in community, to know what it was to be seeking the welfare of the community. And to do that, they actually went for virtue rather than values. They went for what exists in and of itself, rather than saying, well, we're going to be this. It's what's actually there as almost like an eternal value, which they'd call a virtue, that we should be seeking after. And once we discover that, then we are pursuing something that's good, something that's beautiful, and something that is true.
You mentioned both virtue and values. So what's the difference?
Well, I think value, if you look at the history of it, is almost only 100 to 200 years old. And it goes back to Nietzsche. So Friedrich Nietzsche, in his discussion over, well, if you're not going to have virtues, you're going to have things that, and there's a godless society, so God is dead. What you're going to do is to decide, well, what values are you going to have? Now, for a long time in the history of this country, values and virtue almost walked hand in hand. So we were trained as a civilization that had its roots in Western civilization, but also had connections back to the Judeo-Christian ethic. So if the Bible said that love was what we should be, well, that was a value we took on. But it was actually a virtue. It was not something that we have decided, oh, we want that one and give it a tick. So I struggle a little bit with schools that decide, here are the 5 values that we're going to have in our school. Well, why those? Which is sort of like what goes back to what the Corinth and Sparta and Athens were deciding. What values should we have? And a fascinating book that I would love other educators to read is something written by Plato, which is called Laws. And when you open up book 1, there's this fascinating discussion between 3 Greeks from 3 different cities who are on this journey together to Crete. And as they're walking through Crete, they're having this discussion. What is the basis of your laws? Are your laws from God or are they from man? What a fascinating question for someone who doesn't believe in the God that we do, to be asking other people, what is the basis of your law? So then you ask, what is the basis of your values? And if you come back to saying, well, it's not about values, it's about virtue, then you are trying to find the things that have been established by God, which is traditionally called in the liberal arts approach, truth, beauty and goodness. So these things are what needs to be discovered. So when you come to an interesting discussion, and I'll just hold it up for the camera, you come to what C.S. Lewis wrote in The Abolition of Man. He reflects on what is in the English curriculum in around the 1940s, 1950s by looking at something called the Green Book. The Green Book was written by 2 people that he doesn't name directly, and he says there's this fascinating discussion where they are saying, is a waterfall pretty or is a waterfall sublime? And the basis of the book is we decide what is beautiful. So that adage that the beauty is in the eye of the beholder is what this book holds up in terms of the Green Book. And Lewis goes after them. Lewis just says, how could you decide as educators what is good and what is beautiful? And in one sense, if you go and look at the statement that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, is about 1870s that it came out. But it's swept through our culture. It's common even within a Christian school to say, make a choice. Do you like that or do you not like that? Rather than saying there is something far more transcendent that we should be following and investigating. So Lewis in his book starts with the abolition of, this discussion over the abolition of man, where it says that our current climate is such that we are dismantling the ideas of virtue and we are replacing with values. They're my words, you won't find those directly. But he then calls us back out of values, back into virtue, back out of us deciding what is pretty, instead of saying that's a pretty sunset or that is a pretty waterfall. A waterfall is beautiful because a waterfall is doing what it was designed to do. Waterfalling is the way God designed it. So when a waterfall is doing it, it is beautiful. And when a fly lands on my nose, it is doing what it was designed to do, to be a scavenger rather than an irritant. That once we start to realise that God has put these things in our universe to fulfil a greater plan than just keeping me happy and to take me away from the centre of it, then I'm actually starting to discover what is true, what is good, what is beautiful. And as I go on that journey, I'm starting to discover what it is to be polite. Because once you've got a community that is seeking after something transcendent, something more than themselves, and it's not just all about what is useful at the moment, then you've actually started to find something that'll keep your community together. So it's built around the concept polite over what it is to be human, and what is the purpose of life.
So moving on from that, thinking about truth, beauty, goodness,
Yep.
purpose of life,
Yep.
and developing, building our people to be polite, what does that look like in a school community for you? What does it look like, on a day-to-day basis?
I think the leaders of schools have got to go on a journey to try to fully understand what education is. If education is about getting a job, if education is just about getting someone to do something rather than to be something, I think we are on the bottom rung of the ladder. What we have to do is to actually climb the ladder to say, okay, yes, people need a job, people need an income, but unless they've got a reason for that, then they're not really going to be something. And this is what these policies realised, was that if everyone was just busy doing and no one was there thinking and no one was contemplating about what does it mean to be good and building that, then what we'll just have is a whole lot of busy ants doing their job but without purpose. And if the purpose simply is to have a better house, a better income, then we are certainly selling short what the gospel's all about. So I think the journey for people is to go from evaluating what they see as the goal of education, and in the laws, which is fascinating for it to come from a non-Christian or a non-theistic person. Plato starts talking about, in quoting Socrates, that education is actually about turning out a good man. Wow, what does that mean? And what does it mean within a Christian school to turn out a good citizen, a good thinker, someone who will be able to handle power well, will be able to interact with those in society for whom are outcasts, who will be able to think about how do I serve others rather than it all about me. And I think Christian schools have got to address this, because at the moment our model of what is success, I think, is too similar to what the school down the road is doing.
So how do we do that? How do we, as Christian schools, how do we address that?
Well, I think educators, the leaders, need to go on a journey. They need to be questioning things. They need to get into almost a Socratic style of thinking, that they are questioning what they're doing and why they are doing it. And then trying to interact with people from other perspectives, people that have written so that we can read them because they're not here, like Lewis and Chesterton, Socrates. There are a myriad of people who have got views on these things that we have, in a sense, pushed to the side because we just want our modern gurus to tell us what to do. So if you asked an educator at the moment, who are the 4 or 5 people that have influenced your thinking, it'd be a surprise to see it go beyond the current educators, the current conferences they're going to. And where is the voice of those that have gone before, who have given us the tradition we're in now? Where are they doing that? So there's a fascinating book I'd like to put out to people to be thinking. It's called In the Year of Our Lord 1943, written by Alan Jacobs. And he, as a historian, 1943, time of the war, he talks about how the Allies now seem to be getting the ascendancy, that the Allies are going to win. Obviously, a lot of Europe is now devastated by the bombings and the war and all the very much tragedy associated with that. So they start to write and think, what will we do as the winners? What will society be like? What do we need to teach so that this does not happen again? If you think of the First World War, it was the war to end all wars. But the way that the First World War was handled and its outcomes, in many historians' eyes, was the seedbed of the Second World War. So in Alan Jacobs' book, he takes 5 great thinkers of the time and he starts to talk about how they viewed this thing. And it all happened in 1943. So Lewis is one of those, T.S. Eliot, you've got Jacques Maritain and Simone Weil, and the last one is an interesting guy called, I will get his name. I'm going to call it a Hearn, but I'll come back and make sure I got the right name. Adern. He's a non-Christian who finds himself in New York City in a very pleasurable state for his choice of lifestyle. He goes to a local theatre in 1943, end of 1942, and it just happens to be where a lot of Germans are. And on the screen comes sort of that newsreel story over what's happening in the war. And these people stood up and they cheered Hitler. And they were saying death to the others. And he was shocked. He's an Englishman living in America, and he found these people almost with great vehement reaction pro-Hitler when he just, as he was willingly killing other people. And he said, on what value, on what right do I have to say that they are wrong rather than just a personal preference? And so that started him on a journey to go back to his roots to find out where the Word of God actually fitted in to give him his measuring stick, because he had no measuring stick at that time. And so he writes, and he's written some brilliant stuff. So this book, in the year of our Lord, 1943, Alan Jacobs starts to talk about these people who are, in that sense, almost a reconstructing of society. What should society look like? And how do we treat other people? How do we now form a good society? It's almost this whole question of a polite society being revisited. And every generation is going to face this. How do we build for the future? And what do we want our young people to do? So that's where I think our educators have got to come to grips with it. Like, what are we turning out at the moment? What are our young people becoming like? So we've just had our graduation, and I'm thrilled with our young people, where they are. But if we don't get to their thinking, if we don't get them to be able to question where they are and what's influencing them, then they'll just swim in the culture, and they'll end up downstream where they don't want to be, but they've just been swept along. So Christian schools have got a great opportunity to be sharing with young people of what it is to be good, what it is to be human, and what does God expect. And it's not just a sermon. It's not just more altar calls. It's actually changing the way people think. It's changing their questioning ability and their understanding really of Christ and how he trained his disciples.
So for leaders who are new, and we've got a couple of schools next year that have got brand new principals, and we've got other leaders that are stepping into a new space for next year in leadership. Where would they start, Richard?
Well, I think they need to be intrigued by people like me to say, what planet is he on? What is he reading? Maybe I should look at some of the things. I've got some other books that I think would be really interesting to look at.
Such as?
Well, if you go to the original word for school, it comes from the Greek word skole. And when you look at what the word skole meant, it was leisure. Schools were about teaching people what to do in their leisure, not what to do in their employment. So what do I do when I'm free? What do I do when I've got time to myself? What am I contributing? And the book is called Leisure by Joseph Piper, and it's a powerful book to try to get people to start to think about what is the purpose of education. It's written by a German. It's maybe 60, 50 years old, but it's got some powerful things to consider. As I've talked about the abolition of man. Another book that I think would be really good for our leaders to be looking at is a book on Johannes or John Comenius. An amazing godly man in the 1600s who in one sense wrote the first textbooks. And David Smith is a great supporter of him, and he's the one through whom I've become acquainted with the workings of Comenius. He wrote a lot on theology, he did a whole range of things. But for almost 200 years, his was the first textbook, and it got copied by others, but his was the textbook. And it put things in a context. And his opening chapter was about, in the nature of things, was about God. And then as David Smith outlines in his work, he talks about how that was sort of put to the side. We started with some other context. So my question to educators is, where do we land our students in the God story? And when we talk about God's story, for many people, that's just the story of salvation. No. It's far bigger than that. It's why are we here in the first place? And we are really here to discover truth, beauty, and goodness, to find God, to seek after him. And when you look at what Jesus' first question to some people, he says, what do you seek? In John chapter 1. And that's a fascinating question for us all to engage with. What do we really seek? And we should be seeking after truth. We should be seeking after the kingdom. We should be seeking after who we are and why are we here, and ultimately who is Christ.
You talked about Comenius before. So interestingly enough, Jeff van der Vliet this year, so principal at Toowoomba Christian College, in his principal's address this year, he talked about Comenius. And ACS is running a series of lectures next year in conjunction with the Millis Institute, and we've called them the Comenius Lectures.
Wonderful.
So very, very timely. I'm conscious about time, Richard. Do you have some other books just as we're bringing around? And I guess just some tips for us as leaders moving forward about how we go about training polite people. Where do we start? Where do the conversations start?
Yeah. You've got to find some like-minded people that are willing to provoke your thinking. Could be within your school. Could be places like the Millis Institute. Could be places that are promoting a liberal arts education, because that's really what we are talking about. How do we train people to be free? So we're going to give them responsibility and lead. That's a freedom. How are they going to lead us? So I think there are places around, there's material that you could find. It's a bit like, I'll put the challenge back to staff. What are you seeking? If you're seeking it, you'll find it. There are people around who are talking this language within the Christian schools sector. Seek them out. Ask them questions. Start the dialogue. For me, where I am in 2021 is most probably the continuation of an understanding that started to unfold in 2009. So it's not like I've just woken up with this thing and I've got the latest hot topic. It's a continuation of a dream that I got when I was travelling in 2009 just to a conference in England, and then was blown away by walking into Oxford thinking like, wow, what is this place? But not just in terms of the spectacular architecture and the vibe of the place. This place has been influential. This is a place that trained ministers. This is a place that trained thinkers of the future. What did they grapple with? What were their answers? What were their questions? So it started me on a bit of a journey, Lynne, to say education is about looking into these areas and then trying to take our staff and our students on this journey. In terms of other books, yeah, there's books out there on liberal arts that you could have a look at. There are various institutions that might be worth looking at. But I think it's trying to come to grips with
Is it the conversations?
Yeah, it's the conversation.
And challenging what are we doing in our schools?
Yeah.
And what is it that is developing truth, beauty and goodness? And the journey that we're on, and maybe questioning and challenging, okay, what are we doing? And that's not building truth, beauty and goodness, and the journey may need to take a different tact.
Well said.
Richard, thank you for joining me this morning, and I'd love to explore this conversation a little bit more with some other people next year before you retire. I'm very conscious about you finishing your time with Toowoomba Christian College, but we want to be able to continue the conversation. So are you happy for that?
Very happy. One of the things I want to do in retirement is all those things that I've said, I need to read that. Get them off the shelf, get them out of the computer, and because There's so many good resources out
there. There is, absolutely. So thank you for joining me. This morning's podcast around how do we train polite people has been with my good friend and colleague, Richard Brown, Principal at Toowoomba Christian College. Richard, thank you.
My pleasure.